So we began our journey with African American literature of the 20th century with the Harlem Renaissance, which really focused on the period between World War I and World War II. The next snapshot of African American poetry we're going to explore is the Black Arts Movement, which really centers on the 60s, the mid-60s in particular, and lasts about 10, 15 years into the 70s and 80s. And a lot of the next round of great and most famous and highly regarded African American poets emerges from or is connected in some way to the Black Arts Movement. And we're going to be using this really cool Poetry Foundation site that explores the movement. And what I want you to do is first read about it. There's a nice introduction to the movement, amounts to a couple of pages, but it really lays out the context, some of the key figures, and some of the key ideas. And as you can see, it's only 4 or 5 paragraphs. So it's really worth investing yourself, taking the time exploring it. After that, you're going to see on the site that there are over 20 different poets presented here. Of course, I don't expect you to read all 20. The list begins with 2 of the most representative ones, Amiri Baraka and Gwendolyn Brooks, and then goes on and shares 18 other terrific poets. I suggest you start with Baraka and Brooks and read all 6 of their poems and then move on from there. Ultimately, your goal is going to be to jump around, explore this list, look at as many different poets and poems as you can, and assemble a list of 8 poems that you want to focus on. 8 poems. And for those 8 poems that you decide to focus on, I want you to, for each poem, type in the title of the poem into your response and turn that title into a link using the method we've been using all semester. So your post should end up with 8 poems with links to them. Now, those poems can come from any of these poets. So you could do 3 each from 2 or 3 poets, or you could sprinkle the 8 without and have 8 different poets. But for each poem, provide the name of your poet and then a link to the poem, and you're going to end up with 8. Now, as you think about which 8 you want to go with, I suggest you pick out 8 that you find really interesting, 8 that you like, 8 that you feel like, hey, I could write about this in the paper that I'm going to be doing in a couple of weeks. That way, not only will you be completing this activity, you'll be setting yourself up to do well on the next paper. By the way, at the end of this collection, there's a phenomenal collection of articles and blog posts about and/or related to this poetry. And all of this is material that you're welcome to use as you develop your paper later. So a lot of great tools here for and about African American poetry, particularly the Black Arts Movement. So once again, you're beginning this project by curating. You're going to choose 8 poems, any combination, provide links to all 8 with the names of the poets so we know who wrote it and the poem title. And again, you're thinking about what would be interesting to write about later. And then for this activity, you will then pick one of the 8 poems that you selected, and you will write an analysis. And your analysis will have 2 elements. They can be woven together, or you can parse them out separately, whatever works for you. But I want you to look at the symbolic language in your poem, pick out 1 or 2 metaphors, metonyms, allusions, ironies, images, and really talk about them. Get yourself back into shape after your spring break away from this stuff. And then make a connection. And now, when you connect the poem, you have 3 options. You can connect the poem to a theoretical idea. And remember, we have the link to all of our theory materials on our course homepage. Or you can connect the poem to another poem that you've studied on this pathway. So another African American poet. And then finally, you could connect the poem to your life. I want to discourage you from trying to do all 3 of those things and instead think about one connection. In my experience, the best past posts are going to look at one or two examples of figurative language, of symbolic language, and connect it to either theory or another poem or poet from the pathway or your life. Generally, trying to mix too many of those things together ends up with a really unfocused post. But there's lots of material for you to play with, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with and having you share with each other.